Hello and welcome to World Insight on CCTV News. I'm Joe in Beijing. Coming up on today's program, Russia's veto of a UN resolution on Syria and Putin cancelling a trip to France are the latest signs of Moscow's worsening ties with the West. How have Russia and the West opposing stances in Syria's civil war stoked the fires? And we sat down with Russian political scientist Sergey Karaganov at the Xiangshan Forum on Security. He spoke about Russian relations with the U.S. and the Eurasia network and how Moscow's pivot to East is strengthening ties with Beijing. Well, we'll begin today's show with the state of relations between Russia and Western countries. After Russia vetoed France's UN resolution on bombing in Aleppo last week, the situation in Syria is becoming more complex. France suggested Russia could face war crimes charges over its bombardment of the city, while the US and UK also criticized Russia's stance on Syria. Russian President Vladimir Putin denied such accusations, calling them rhetoric and saying they didn't take reality into account. But the strained ties between these powers run a lot deeper. Let's take a look.
A new standoff. The war of words between Russia and Western countries is continuing, resulting in Russian President Vladimir Putin cancelling a planned visit to France. The United Nations Saturday failed to pass either a resolution on Syria backed by the West or a rival motion sponsored by Russia. One of the resolutions was France's calling for an end to the bombing in Aleppo, but Russia imposed its veto, saying the document failed to take into account Russian proposals.
France is in major disagreement with Russia over Syria, and the Russian veto on the French resolution at the UN Security Council has prevented the cessation of the bombings and the implementation of a ceasefire.
Meanwhile, Russia's text amended the French draft by removing the demand for an end to airstrikes. That failed to get a minimum 9 votes.
I am deeply convinced that it is our Western partners, first and foremost the United States, that are responsible for the situation that has prevailed in the region, and in Syria in particular, and its allies, including leading European countries.
Moscow has repeatedly denied attacking civilians, saying it only targets terrorist groups in Syria. But the UK says it has evidence pointing to Russia being behind an airstrike in September on a UN convoy bound for Aleppo, which killed at least 20 people.
If President Putin's strategy is to restore the greatness and the glory of Russia, then I believe he risks seeing his ambition turn to ashes in the face of international contempt for what is happening in Syria.
Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov and his US counterpart John Kerry will meet this weekend to discuss the ongoing conflict. But the situation in Syria does not only concern Russia and the US. More countries are involved, each with a different stance on this complex issue.
And for more discussions on the topic, we're joined in the studio by Mr. Cheng Jianqun, of course, a scholar of the American Studies Department at the China Institute of International Studies. And in Moscow, we have Dmitry Babish, political analyst from Sputnik International News Agency. And in London, we invited Thomas Freya, research fellow at the European Leadership Network. Welcome, gentlemen. Let me start with you, Dmitry. The Western countries have been blaming Russia for bombardment of Aleppo, but President Putin said the deaths of civilians, of course, is a reality of war, but Russia is not going to allow terrorists, he said, terrorists, to hide among the local people in Aleppo and use them as human shields. So how should we understand President Putin's tone? Does that mean Russia will continue to bombard the eastern Aleppo, a stronghold by the militants? Dmitry.
Well, it's not just President Putin who says that there are terrorists in eastern Aleppo. The UN Secretary General just recently proposed, let me quote him, withdrawing the forces of Jabhat al-Nusra from eastern Aleppo. And Jabhat al-Nusra has declared itself an affiliate of Al-Qaeda a few years ago. It had a rebranding later on, but very few people believe that it really changed its spots, you know, like a leopard cannot change its spots. Actually, let me remind you that the plan the original plan of Russia and the United States was that the United States would separate in the forces opposed to Mr. Assad, the United States would separate the moderate groups and the jihadist groups. The United States would give this information to Russia, and that would allow Russia to pinpoint its strikes against the groups which are really terrorists. As we know, the United States didn't fulfill its part of the agreement. Russia never received any information on the groups opposing Mr.
without
Assad.
information to differentiate from different groups, Russia will continue its all-inclusive bombardment in Aleppo, which might result in the casualties of civilians.
You are sort of trying to answer for me to your own question. I think that what's going on in Aleppo is the Syrian government forces, the only legal forces operating in Syria, together with Russian forces invited by the legal Syrian government. They are fighting against an insurgency supported by foreign powers. Let me remind you that the United States, facing a much smaller threat to its security in 1945, used not barrel bombs but atomic bombs in Japan. And no one went to jail in the United States for that. So the talk of the war crimes, which was started by Mr. Kerry and which was carried on by his, I would say, satellites, the French and the British officials, that talk is absolutely out of place in this situation, to my mind.
Tom, obviously the Western leaders don't think that the Russians are targeting terrorists. Your Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, has said what Russia has been doing is a war crime. Tom?
Well, it's certainly the case that the Russian strikes have been targeting some critical civilian infrastructure. There has been repeated targeting of hospitals and other medical clinics. Whilst it is, of course, the case that all the Syrian groups in eastern Aleppo tend to be intermixed, so it is incredibly difficult to differentiate who is who on the ground. But it can't be overlooked that that civilian targets have formed a very large part of the Russian strike list.
But the Russians are not meant to target the civilian targets. It's just collateral damage that sometimes is unavoidable.
This isn't the case. We have reason to believe that they are purposefully targeting these sites as a part of the broader siege of the city. I view this as a reasonably cynical attempt to take advantage of the insular nature of the West at this present time. We have to bear in mind that we're facing an imminent US presidential election. With Brexit, there are general elections upcoming in France and in Germany. This is a uniquely insular time for the West. So I view it as the Syrian regime and its Russian and Iranian allies as taking advantage of this moment to consolidate control over the heavily populated western portion of Syria. And whether this means ending the siege quickly, and the lack of ground forces available for the Syrian regime inevitably means that air power and artillery play a very heavy role.
Mr. Tong, how do you look at the different definitions by Russians and the Western powers of terrorists and the way they deal with this problem in Syria? Obviously, they don't see eye to eye on this.
Actually, the standoff between Russia and the United States started from last February, when the government troops took an offensive posture against the anti-government troops in Syria, of course with the help of Russian military forces. So this is actually the main reason for the two sides to have such a standoff, because the United States and some other Western countries are worrying about the future of the anti-government troops. And for example, in Aleppo, actually the government troops surrounded the anti-government troops, and they carry out some operations against these groups. And that's why we have witnessed the rounds of negotiations in Geneva, in Vienna, and this is actually a competition between the two major powers, not only the war against the terrorists.
But they cannot agree, all those are against the Syrian government, whether they are terrorist elements or they are simply against President Bashar al-Assad?
Yeah, I think this is a very fundamental issue we're facing now. How can we give a clear-cut definition on which is a terrorist and which is a government? This is very difficult for some countries. For example, the French government just gave a resolution in UN Security Council and vetoed by the Russian delegation. And I think according to UN Charter, Bashar is still the legal leader of that country, and the anti-government troops, of course, is actually some side for the war. They should give their fundamental reason why they carry out such a war. This is actually a civil war. So I think you cannot give any clear-cut definition on which is the illegal and legal. So the outsiders, I mean, the United States and Russia should take very fair, position, not only for the sake of the major powers, not for the sake of the Syrian people.
Let's talk about the resolutions you mentioned. There are opposing draft resolutions provided by France and Russia. The French and the Spanish draft demands an immediate halt to the area of bombardment and military flights over the city of Aleppo, as well as immediate, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access throughout the country. While the Russian draft urged an immediate cessation of hostilities, particularly in Aleppo, demands parties prevent financial support reaching groups associated with Al-Qaeda, ISIL, or Al-Nusra. So, in your opinion, what is the major difference between these two versions of resolutions, and are the differences reconcilable and negotiable?
It's really difficult for the two sides to give any compromise in this regard, because they do have very different approaches and targets in dealing with the situation in Syria. For example, Russia, of course, supported the government, the legal government, and the United States and some other Western countries just support anti-government forces in Syria. So if this situation continued, I'm sure the clash will be continued, because the major power, they just want to have the dominance in that country, and of course this is one part of the major powers Middle East policy. So the compromise should be very difficult for the two sides.
Dimitri, earlier Tom mentioned that now is the lame duck session for U.S. American presidency, so that's why Russia took the chance to make military moves on Aleppo, because it speculated that the U.S. will not take any massive military intervention at this moment. Is this what Russians has been thinking about?
Certainly not. I think that the Western analysts, they're ascribing to the Russian leaders intentions and thoughts which our leaders never had. We don't care so much for the elections in the United States or in Western Europe, and certainly the tragedy in Aleppo is much more important than the outcome of elections. When your previous speaker said that you cannot talk about legality when you have a civil war, I don't entirely agree, because Syria had been a remarkably peaceful country for decades under the rule of the Assad family. There were no millions of refugees coming from there to Europe, and suddenly it became a country destroyed by the war after the so-called democratization campaign, which was led by Hillary Clinton. Let me remind you that Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State when the civil war.
So you believe
Syria
the civil
started,
war was created
and
initiated by America?
So, for some reason, you didn't interrupt the previous speakers, but I will answer your question. You know, Mrs. Clinton, when she was the Secretary of State, she said openly that we would pay salaries to those Syrian soldiers who would desert. Of course, the Syrian soldiers did not desert because if they desert, their relatives and their communities were going to die as a result of the advance of the Islamist troops. So in Syria, what we have is not just a civil war, but a civil war started by outside forces which supported radicals inside Syria. We have the jihadists who came from Libya, who came from Palestine, from other countries, and these jihadists, for some reason, fight on the same side which the Western countries support. They fight against President Assad. Imperfect as he was, but the country was not ravaged by war, and millions of people did not leave it when Mr. Assad was in power all over Syria. If we talk about the elections in the West and the effect that they may have on the war in Syria and Iraq, I'm very concerned about Mosul right now, because there is information that the Western coalition, you know, the Iraqi army and the Kurdish militia and the Turkish armed units, they may try to take Mosul before the U.S. election on the November of the 8th.
Tom,
and let me remind you that Mosul is a megapolis with a population which used to be 3 million. So if they start that operation, Aleppo will not look such a tragedy compared to what they're going to do to Mosul. People should be concerned about this at that particular
Tom,
moment.
would you like to respond to what Dimitri has been saying? In the first place, what is going on in Syria is part of blame what the Western has been doing to meddling with them.
Firstly, I would take issue with the fact that Syria had been an overtly peaceful country before this particular uprising. You need to bear in mind that the regime of the current President Assad's father put down a similar democratically inspired uprising, resulting in the deaths of tens of thousands of civilians. And I do take issue also with the accusation that this is a Western-inspired revolt, as we saw across the wider Middle East.
But the Western country has been providing finance and support to those anti-government elements in Syria. Isn't that the case?
This is true, yes, but this is in response to an incredibly brutal regime. The Assad regime, the atrocities that they've perpetrated on their own people is the overwhelming cause of the refugee crisis that we see, of the destruction of Syria's once great cities. It is the regime that is primarily responsible for this. Blaming the West is looking for shadows that just aren't there.
But without a sound plan in advance, what the West has been meddling has led to chaos, a messy situation in Syria. I don't think the Western government should take some of the blames.
I do agree that there should have been a more joined-up approach to Syria. The approach, the West is reticent to involve itself to a greater degree because of its experience in Iraq and more recently in Libya. And this has led to somewhat of a disjointed approach to the Syrian civil war. But as has been previously mentioned, this is an incredibly complex situation, and determining a way forward is not easy.
And Dimitri, what is the strategy of Russia in carrying out more military actions to helping President Assad in managing his country? What is the end game for Russia?
Well, let me tell you that if you look at the speeches of the Russian leaders, they never said that they were helping Assad. Actually, Assad was criticized by the Russian foreign minister on many occasions. Of course, it's an imperfect regime.
But Russia still believes that Assad is the legitimate government leader of Syria.
Yes, there was this uprising which Tom just mentioned, but I can't call it a peaceful uprising. They took hostage several dozen soldiers, and the uprising was led by the Muslim Brotherhood in 1980s. These were not peaceful people. And of course, Russia, when it decided to send planes to Syria, Russia was not so much helping the Syrian government as Russia was preventing that Syria would fall into the hands of the Islamic State. Let me remind you that the US-led coalition had been bombing Syria and other areas held by the Islamic State for 11 months before Russia got involved. And somehow the Islamic State did not shrink. It only expanded when the US planes and other Western planes were bombing them. Only when Russia got involved, suddenly the Islamic State started to shrink, and they got problems in many provinces, and even we are now talking about Raqqa being targeted by the Kurdish militias. So Russia's end game, if you want, is to prevent the creation of a terrorist state on the territory of Syria and Iraq. But we had a terrible experience in the 1990s when radicals from Saudi Arabia financed the so-called Chechen rebellion in Russia. And only when this financing ended.
But Dmitry, it seems that the British and the French still believe what
if there is a legal
Russians have been
state
doing
in Syria which finances uprisings in Russia, of course it's going to be more painful than the Chechen uprising.
And they will probably continue with economic sanctions in the future. Do you think it is worth it?
Well, I think that anything is worth if you want to prevent the creation of a terrorist state on the territory of Syria and Iraq. Just imagine what would happen if Mr. Obama went ahead with his intention to bomb the Syrian government troops in 2013. The Islamic State was already in existence then. It was in the final stages of its formal institutionalizing.
Okay.
So if Obama had bombed the Syrian government troops, the jihadists would have taken Damascus with all the chemical and other weapons.
I understand Russians worry now. We have only 1 minute left. I want you to have a very short take on the possibility of U.S. and Russia having another round of negotiations and maybe have some political settlement on this issue. Tom, what is your estimate of the likelihood?
I think this is unlikely. Whilst I welcome talks, the underlying issues that caused the previous ceasefire to collapse haven't been addressed. So I'm cautious in my optimism.
And Mr. Tong, what is your estimate?
Is not so optimistic about the future of the relations between the two countries, I mean between Russia and the United States, especially in dealing with the challenges in Syria, because this is a competition both in negotiation table and also in the battlefield.
And Dmitry, are you optimistic negotiating with Americans to come with any kind of deal?
In the end, I am optimistic. Even if we don't achieve an agreement in Lausanne, it's interesting that Mr. Kerry, having already declared a diplomatic blockade of Russia, is still talking with us about these issues. And in the end, I am sure Russia and the United States will agree on the fight against terrorism.
Okay.
I don't know why that would happen, because of new terrorist actions against the United States, or because the administration would change in the United States. But I am sure we will reach an agreement, and Mr. Obama will go down in shame in history as the president who supported terrorists.
On that optimistic note, we have to end our discussions. Thank you very much, Dmitry, Tom, and thank you, Mr. Tong. And you've been watching here World Insight here on CCTV News, and there's much more coming ahead on this program, including we'll bring you our exclusive interview with leader of Russia's Council on Foreign and Defense Policy, Sergey Karaganov. He gives us a Russian perspective on Moscow's relations with the U.S. as well as its ties to the East, in particular with China. From multilateral relations between Russia and the West, we now go to one bilateral relationship that always stays in the center, Russia-U.S. ties. But their strained ties run deeper than differences on Syria. Russia has considered restoring military bases in Vietnam following U.S. warships making port calls there. And the U.S. has accused Russia of a series of hacks, most recently into the Democratic Party's National Committee system in the U.S. My colleague Tian Wei sat down on the sidelines of the 7th Xiangshan Forum in Beijing, a high-level security affairs dialogue with Sergey Karaganov a Russian political scientist who heads the Council on Foreign and Defense Policies. He shared his opinions on Russia's relations with the U.S.
Professor Karaganov, welcome to CCTV News World Insight.
My great pleasure.
Some were suggesting that it seems that Russia can develop a good relationship or sound relationship with any country but the United States. What would you say?
Well, at this juncture, we hope to have a very friendly relationship with the United States eventually, when the United States overcome its present difficulties, where the United States is now is deeply internally divided. It is in a revanchist mood after winning 15 years ago, then losing 10 years ago almost everything or more that it had won, and also it is living through a period of adaptation to post-hegemonic order. I mean, it seemed 15-20 years ago that there is one world and it is run by the United States. It was unhistorical, anti-historical, and it failed. But it failed even more bitter than when previously was thought, because of relatively unwise, very unwise, and incursions into Afghanistan, Iraq, which were lost. So basically, we will wait until the United States will adapt to the new world, and of course we shall try to build a working relationship with them. I think that the policy of the United States or China, and that is a policy of neo-containment, is unwise.
You talk about Russia will wait for the United States to find its own way, and yet Washington has been accusing Moscow of interfering in this round of presidential election by taking away information that are, as they say, extremely important for the political candidates.
It reflects the depth of the crisis in the United States. Politically, it is an isolationist country. It never takes into consideration other countries, especially in the internal debate, when Russia is one of the major issues on the agenda of the election campaign. That shows the depth of the crisis. Of course, Russia says that it has nothing to do with it is not interfering. But when we hear the accusations, we just say, do you remember the tries to organize color revolutions all over the world? I mean, in Georgia, Ukraine.
How is that compared to the presidential election?
I mean, you interfered, and now you're lamenting that allegedly somebody is interfering. So that means that if you live in Crystal Palace, don't throw stones. There are others who could throw stones much better.
So Russia did or did not get the information?
Of course it did not. At least officially we said there is no, that the government has not been involved at all. There are Russians, private by the way, Russians, hackers, who claim that they have done it. And they are even acknowledged. Might be we have very brilliant, IT people, so might be somebody did it, but the government is not directly involved, or it says it is not involved.
What about the issue of Syria with the United States? What do you think will be Russia's role?
We are there to kill as many terrorists as possible and to steer the unraveling Middle East to the extent possible. It will be unraveling anyway for internal reasons. As the Russian-US compromises, I mean, originally the United States rejected any common work with Russia. Then they agreed, and the next day after they agreed, American forces bombed a regiment of Syrian troops, injuring 150. It was a very well premeditated attack. So the question now was, I mean, in Russian eyes, whether either the political leadership does not control the military, which is bad, very bad, or else, I mean, the political leadership is lying to us. So Russia, in a way, has decided then to go for a bust supporting the Syrian government, which is a legitimate, by the way, government, unlike American actions which are illegitimate from the point of view of international law.
But Russia has also been accused by the United States not surprisingly, that Russia has been doing some of the harms to the local people over there. For example, even killing some of the UN workers or related people. That has been an accusation. Russia responded.
Well, let's put it this way. I mean, there was a terrible war. And people die in a terrible civil war. We want to finish it by restoring the legitimate government. We have had, I mean, many cases of other forces bombing, I mean, civilian objects. I mean, 3 days ago, I mean, Saudis killed 400 people in a peaceful procession. Americans bombed hospitals, but I don't want to trade accusations. We are supporting the legitimate government, in the hope that to end this terrible conflict.
But when you are saying that Russia is supporting the legitimate government, that's exactly the clashing point, isn't it? That the West, particularly the United States, does not want to support the Assad regime. So is there any room for negotiation about the outside
we are on the
powers?
part of law, and they are on law and order. They are on the side of disorder and criminality. So, I mean, it's a different position. I think that morally we are right. But we are all participating in the civil war. So, I mean, people die there.
Differences between Russia and the West may not necessarily result in Moscow stepping back from the region, but always mean a step closer to the East. The Russia-led Eurasian Economic Union is an example of this, and now Moscow is eyeing an even bigger project, the Greater Eurasia. This larger entity could also include China, India, Pakistan, Iran, and former Soviet states, with the aim of developing trade and lower tariff barriers. But Russia denies an anti-West emphasis, citing invitations to the European nations to participate. That plan of connecting Europe and Asia together is echoed by the China-led Belt and Road Initiative. First announced by Chinese President Xi Jinping during a 2013 visit to Kazakhstan, the initiative aims to improve cooperation with countries across vast parts of Asia, Europe and Africa. Many see great potential for the two visions to link together rather than compete with each other, bringing favourable outcomes to the countries involved.
You are one of those instrumental figures in bringing out the idea of Eurasia. Help us to understand how they started.
The idea of Greater Eurasia, I mean, Eurasia has been here with us, I mean, for many millenniums of years. I mean, a Greater Eurasia is a concept geared at creation on the Eurasian space, on the space of our whole continent, a zone of economic openness and liberal economic order, zone of respect towards sovereignty and towards freedom of choice of people, zone of connectivity in terms of infrastructure, and eventually it should involve countries from maybe Japan or Korea, and down from China, Russia, and towards Europe, and down towards India. And because the world is getting deglobalized, fractioning, I think we have to start an opposite positive tendency, at least on the space of Eurasia.
Talking about the common space, there are people suggesting redundancies, as they say, between the idea of Greater Eurasia and also Belt and Road initiatives from China. What would you say?
The One Belt, One Road initiative and its pairing with the Eurasian Economic Union is within this bigger concept. It does not involve, it involves mostly, One Belt, One Road involves mostly countries of Central Eurasia, which is a building step, but we have to involve, I mean, countries also like India, Korea, and eventually Europe into this road. So it is a big idea, and also One Belt, One Road is most economic idea. I mean, it's spreading wealth and economic stability, but Greater Eurasia is also economic, political idea. It's an idea to build a new foundation of the world order while the old is disintegrating.
What would you make of the difficulties implementing these ideas?
There are no contradictions which are really deep. And if we have a common goal, I mean, it will be easier to look over these contradictions from a height. In Europe, we failed to build a big Europe as it was dreamed of 25, 30 years ago, partly for stupidity of some of their partners, partly for greed, but partially also because we didn't have a good common aim. And we didn't have, I mean, real drivers. I mean, Russia was not enough. Now, with China and Russia joining hands, we could, and eventually bringing in other countries, I think we could succeed to the extent possible.
What are some of the earlier indicators or early harvest that you've already seen about these two ideas, I mean, Greater Eurasia, Belt and Road Initiative, that would give you the confidence to say what you just said?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, Russia has turned east. Mentally, Russian elite, which was, I mean, a European, and was looking at Asia only 2 years ago as a burden or as a threat. Russia has turned east. And China is turning west more and more. I mean, not turning west, I mean, political, but turning west. Now we see that there is, I mean, in Russian terms, there is a start of real growth in Russian Far East and Siberia. I mean, even population for the first time in 40, 50 years, natural growth has started there. I mean, that's Russia, but it's a different world. I mean, we are building. I mean, it's win-win. I mean, we are bettering our relations, not like in old times against somebody, but for the common space. It has already provided for a new view, at least on this area.
Talking about China and Russia, the two countries have experienced quite some ups and downs over the past few decades, let's just put it that way. Is there enough strategic trust between the two?
I think there is. I mean, now, I mean, it's truly unprecedented, this kind of relationship between great powers, and there is strategic trust on the level of thinking of most of the elites, and as far as I understand, I mean, most of the peoples, I mean, trust each other. However, I mean, there are weaknesses in our relationship, and one of these weaknesses is that we are not ready to draft together a common future. One of the ways to do that exactly is to build a Greater Eurasia together with other countries, but being in the lead.
But the countries, when they develop, will they become competitors?
Well, they could become competitors, and should become, because competition drives progress, but they should not become rivals. I mean, naturally, you have your own strength, we have our own strength, so we could combine them, and that would strengthen us both. I mean, China is much more economically potent, we are much more strategically potent, and we will be, because of our history and because of our character, we will be strategically much more potent for quite a while.
The two leadership coming from two sides have been meeting very frequently, Professor, and meanwhile, external circumstances, in a way, has led the two countries together, further together. But question is how sustainable that will be.
Well, that depends on us. I mean,
us meaning?
Of course, us meaning Russians and Chinese. I mean, of course, I mean, outside pressure on Russia from the West and on China from the United States is bringing us together. But we have discovered that there is very little which divides us, and actually why should we not be brought together even without outside pressure? But outside pressure helped.
Anti-missile defense system, for example, joint military exercises, for example. How will these sporadic issues, in a way, influence the direction of our relations?
The security relationships are already very robust. I mean, I would say we are not aiming at a military alliance, and I hope they will not be aiming, but de facto the level of military to military cooperation, including multiple exercises, is on a level higher than many military alliances. And our military really work together, strengthening each other and international peace.
Professor, it's such a pleasure to have you. All the best.
It's my great pleasure to
Thank
be
you,
here.
Professor.
And that's all for today. If you'd like to see more, you can visit our website. You can type World Inside CCTV News into your search engine, or you can check our YouTube channel if you live overseas. And from me, Zhou Yu, and everyone on the team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for more insights from across China and around the world. Goodbye.